This is the greatest domestic policy error, the most consequential domestic policy error in the modern history of this country. And frankly, the Biden administration was complicit in it. They went after governors who didn't want to have kids, young children, wear masks in classrooms. They didn't say anything about governors like Gavin Newsom in California that refused to open schools. Dr. Malkus, in your written testimony, you write that the pandemic caused the largest negative shock to student learning the country has ever seen. You said that the learning losses exceeded those from Hurricane Katrina, and said achievement gaps widened over the course of the pandemic. Would you say that those losses were mainly the result of the pandemic itself or the government's response to it?
This is a great question and an important one, so thank you for it. Typically speaking, we are looking at learning loss that was what was the trajectory of pre-pandemic learning and what did we know well before the pandemic started and then well after the pandemic started. That means that some of the learning loss that we see, and we see it in schools that were also in person, was due to the fact that they were closed all spring unexpectedly. And we were building a plane as we were flying it down the runway to educate those students remotely. In addition, there is some of the total learning loss that occurred in the 2020-21 school year. The fact of the matter is that we see large differences in between those two groups, even though for the spring they had the same missed learning. So that suggests that the difference that we see between them was actually more important because of the differential policy decisions in districts to stay longer. In other words, they both would have had some of the learning loss no matter what. Extended closures were actually more of a differential than the overall differentials.
And the evidence is pretty clear at this point that districts and states that stays closed longer did more harm to their students. Is that right?
That's correct.
And your organization had a tracker for in-person learning. Do you recall which state did the worst in terms of getting students back in the classroom?
I do not have that information off the top of my head, and
I actually just checked it. It happens to be my state of California, very much against what I advocated for. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, issued a statewide shutdown order heading into the fall of 2020. Do you recall, what was the state of the evidence right then as far as the harm of keeping kids out of school versus having them in school?
In early fall 2020 at reopening?
That's right.
It was mixed, and there was a pandemic fog. Some states were blazing ahead. California was not.
How about in the spring of 2021, specifically March, the California supermajority rejected an amendment to open schools. I was actually the author of that amendment. What did the evidence say in March of 2021 about the harms of keeping kids out of school versus having them in school?
By March of 2021, the Centers for Disease, the CDC, had issued clear evidence that it was safe to open schools with mitigation strategies, and it had issued that 2 months prior to the time you're talking about.
By the way, all this time, the governor himself had his own kids in person in private school. What does that tell you about his belief about the benefits versus costs of having kids in school in person?
I will not speak to the governor's own motivations. I'll let you lead your own conclusions on that. However, our family did have to take steps to remove our students largely because we placed our students because we knew that they would be open during the pandemic.
Could you just summarize for us then the harm that we know of now that a state like California did by shutting down its schools unnecessarily for so long?
I believe that these will be dramatic changes from what otherwise would have been. I understand there were differences in learning trajectories before that. Believe me, this is my business. But the pandemic has some of its own consequences. These consequences were dire. They were more dire for disadvantaged people, disadvantaged students in terms of learning loss, and it will be more dire down the line in terms of their life outcomes. All the evidence that we have suggests that this is pretty clearly the case. Anyone concerned with equity should be concerned
That's
with
right.
pandemic learning loss.
And I believe this is the greatest domestic policy error, the most consequential domestic policy error in the modern history of this country. And frankly, the Biden administration was complicit in it. They went after governors who didn't want to have kids, young children, wear masks in classrooms. They didn't say anything about governors like Gavin Newsom in California that refused to open schools. But frankly, we had a lot of schools that were failing well before the COVID shutdowns. And I think that, in a sense, what the shutdowns did, if there's any silver lining at all, is it opened a lot of eyes to the way our education establishment works, that it's really not about the kids. In a state like California, it's never about the kids. But the good news is, I think we're seeing a lot more people now realizing that. Eyes have been opened, and I think there is a growing movement in this country to reorient public education towards a paradigm that is student-centered and parent-directed. Thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back to the chair.